It was a typical autumn afternoon in 1998 when a small landscaping crew began a routine clearing of a neglected, overgrown estate on the outskirts of Munich. They expected nothing more than a long day of hauling brush and tangled ivy, but what they found beneath a heavy, rusted iron grate in the corner of the garden would change the history of the region forever. Hidden in plain sight for over 30 years, a secret was about to be unmasked, one that proved the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who live right next door, protected by the very institutions meant to preserve life. Tonight, we look into the quiet, clinical shadows of Dr. Gerhard Koenig, a man whose steady hands and brilliant mind hid a darkness that no medical textbook could explain. The air in the suburban district of Grunwald is usually crisp, scented with the deep, earthy aroma of the nearby Isar Valley and the faint, sweet smell of wood smoke from the chimneys of the wealthy. It is the kind of place where people move to find a silence that feels earned, a sanctuary of high stone walls and manicured hedges where the neighbors are known only by the quality of their cars and the professional titles on their brass mailboxes. In 1965, the name on one such mailbox was Dr. Gerhard Koenig, a man who lived a life of quiet, clockwork precision. He was a pillar of the medical community, a surgeon whose reputation was as sterile and polished as the instruments he used. But the story of Dr. Koenig doesn't begin in the operating room. It begins in the heavy silence of a house that seemed to absorb sound rather than reflect it. The landscaping crew in 1998 had been hired by a property developer who wanted to turn the old Koenig estate into luxury apartments. The house had stood vacant for nearly a decade after the doctor's death, a crumbling relic of a different era. As the workers cleared the thick, suffocating layers of English ivy from the back of the property, they struck something metallic. It wasn't the sound of a discarded tool or a forgotten pipe. It was the hollow, resonating ring of a heavy iron lid. When they pried it open, the air that escaped from the dark shaft below was cold, smelling of stale concrete and something metallic, like the scent of old coins or dried iron. They had found an underground chamber, a space that was never on any architectural plan, a room that had been buried while the world above went about its business. What they discovered inside that chamber was not a hoard of treasure or a cellar for wine. It was a perfectly preserved medical theater, a miniature version of the grand surgical rooms in the city's teaching hospitals. There were stainless steel tables that caught the dim light from the workers' flashlights, glass cabinets filled with rows of meticulously organized vials, and a collection of surgical saws and scalpels that looked as though they had been cleaned only minutes ago. But it was the presence of a heavy, industrial-grade freezer in the corner that truly chilled the air. Inside that freezer were the remains of what investigators would later identify as the lost history of Munich's forgotten. This discovery triggered a statewide investigation that would peel back the layers of Dr. Koenig's quiet life to reveal a wolf in sheep's clothing, a man who had manipulated the trust of his patients and the loyalty of his staff to fuel a personal obsession with the thin, blurred line between life and death. As we begin our journey into this case, I want to welcome you back. I'm here to help you relax tonight, as we explore one of the most puzzling medical mysteries ever recorded. I know many of you use these stories to find a sense of calm and perspective at the end of a long day, and I'm glad you're here with us in the quiet hours. Tonight's journey begins in a place defined by its tradition and its trust, until the winter of 1965 changed everything for a young nurse named Elsa Schmidt. Adjust your volume, get comfortable, and let's begin our exploration of the edge of death. Elsa Schmidt was only 22 when she accepted the position as Dr. Koenig's private surgical assistant. At the time, she felt like she had won the lottery of the medical world. Dr. Koenig was not just a surgeon, he was a visionary, a man who was rumored to be on the short list for prestigious international awards. To work in his private clinic was to be at the forefront of medical science. The clinic itself was a model of modern efficiency, a white-walled sanctuary where the floors were scrubbed until they shone and the air was perpetually cool and sterile. Elsa would later recall that her first impression of the doctor was one of overwhelming stillness. He didn't move with the frantic energy of other surgeons. He glided, his voice a low, rhythmic hum that seemed to put patients and staff alike into a state of passive drift. But the routine at the clinic was strange, even for the high standards of private German medicine in the mid-60s. Dr. Koenig had a specific set of patients he referred to as his special cases. These were often people without families, travelers passing through, elderly individuals with no heirs, or patients from the outskirts of the city who had no one to check on them. They were brought into the clinic under the cover of night, admitted for what doctor? Koenig described as experimental restorative therapies. He told Elsa that they were working on the very frontier of human biology, trying to understand how the body responds to the absolute limit of its endurance. As the weeks turned into months, Elsa noticed that some of these special cases never seemed to be discharged. She would see them arrive, pale and weary, and she would help prep them for surgery in the small hours of the morning. But by the time her shift ended the next day, their records had been moved to the completed file, and their rooms were already being scrubbed for the next arrival. Dr. Koenig was always ready with an explanation, his voice soft and authoritative. He would tell her that they had been transferred to a recovery center in the mountains for the fresh air, or that their families had come to collect them in the early morning. According to the records, everything was in order, but Elsa couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The silence of the clinic after midnight felt heavy, and the way Dr. Koenig looked at his patients, not as people but as puzzles to be solved, sent a chill down her spine. It was during a particularly humid summer in 1966 that Elsa made her first discovery. She had returned to the clinic late at night to retrieve a forgotten set of keys when she heard a sound coming from the basement. A rhythmic, mechanical thud that she didn't recognize. She followed the sound down the service stairs, past the laundry and the boiler room, to a door she had always assumed was a storage closet for oxygen tanks. It was locked, but through the small, reinforced glass window, she saw a flicker of blue light. It was the same blue light the landscapers would find decades later. In that moment, she saw Dr. Koenig standing over a table, his hands moving with a precision that was both beautiful and terrifying. He wasn't performing a standard surgery. He was documenting something, speaking into a tape recorder in a language that sounded more like philosophy than medicine. As she watched from the shadows, she realized that the patient on the table was one of the forgotten ones. A man named Hans, who had arrived only 2 days prior. Hans wasn't undergoing a restorative therapy. He was being kept in a state of suspended animation, his heart slowed to a crawl by a cocktail of drugs and cooling blankets. Dr. Koenig was observing the point where the soul, as he called it, prepares to leave the vessel. He was measuring the edge of death, recording the minute chemical shifts that occur when the body begins to shut down. To Dr. Koenig, this wasn't a crime. It was a fascinating exploration of the infinite vastness of human consciousness. But to Elsa, it was the unmasking of a monster in plain sight. She fled the clinic that night, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew that if she went to the police, it would be her word against that of a legendary surgeon. Records show that she tried to file a report, but the desk sergeant at the local precinct dismissed her as a nervous young woman who had misinterpreted a complex medical procedure. Dr. Koenig's reputation was his shield, and at the time, no one was willing to pierce it. Elsa was left with a choice: remain silent and safe, or continue to look into the shadows and risk being swallowed by them. For the next year, Elsa became a silent observer, a witness to a secret history that was being written in the basement of a quiet suburban clinic. She started keeping her own records, hidden in a small wooden box under her floorboards at home. She noted the names of the patients, the dates of their arrival, and the specific, chilling details of the theories Dr. Koenig would discuss during their morning rounds. She watched as the doctor's obsession grew, as the experimental became the essential. He was no longer just a surgeon. He was a man who believed he was an architect of the afterlife, and he was using the most vulnerable souls in Munich to build his blueprints. If you're still awake and listening, you might be wondering how a man could operate this way for so long without the community noticing. The answer lies in the safety sandwich Dr. Koenig had built around himself. He was the kind of man who donated to the local church, who offered free consultations to the poor on weekends, and who always had a kind word for the neighbor's children. He was a master of normalcy, a man who used the cover of darkness and the silence of the woods to hide a laboratory that defied every law of God and man. But as we move forward, we will see that even the most meticulous plans have a way of unraveling when the past finally catches up to the present. The discovery in 1998 was only the beginning of a long road to justice, a road that would eventually reveal that Elsa Schmidt hadn't been the only one watching. The landscaping crew's find was the final piece of a puzzle that had haunted the Bavarian investigators for decades. By the time the forensics team arrived at the Koenig estate, the news had already begun to ripple through the quiet streets of Grunwald. People who had lived next door to the doctor for years stood at the police tape, their faces pale as they watched investigators carry out crates of evidence. There were boxes of tapes, thousands of pages of handwritten notes, and most tragically, the identification tags of those who had been left behind in the cold. It was a moment of collective realization. a realization that the good doctor had been a wolf in sheep's clothing, and that the silence they had all enjoyed had been bought with the lives of those the world had forgotten. As we settle in for the next part of this story, let me know where you're watching from tonight. Is it a quiet night in a small town, or are the city lights keeping you company? We're glad you're here with us as we continue to unmask the secrets of Dr. Gerhard Koenig. Rest assured, the justice system eventually caught up with the shadows, and as we look deeper into the evidence, we find a story not just of betrayal, but of the resilience of the truth. Close your eyes. Listen to the rhythmic hum of the story, and let the vastness of the history carry you toward a peaceful night's rest. Imagine a birthday hike on the Palipuka Trail in Hawaii, a place where the emerald cliffs of Oahu meet the infinite blue of the Pacific, turning into a desperate struggle for survival at the edge of a 300-foot drop. The air at that height is usually cool, carrying the faint, salty mist of the ocean below. But on this particular afternoon, the atmosphere felt heavy with an unspoken tension. Dr. Gerhard Koenig, a man whose entire professional life was dedicated to the delicate balance of life and death as a Maui anesthesiologist, stood on that precipice with his wife. It was supposed to be a celebration, a moment of tranquil reflection amid the vastness of the tropical landscape. Instead, it became the setting for a story that would leave the medical community and the quiet island of Maui in a state of profound shock. A respected healer now stands accused of using his medical precision not to save a life, but to systematically end one. Think about the hands of a doctor, hands trained to find veins, to calculate dosages to the microgram, to maintain the rhythmic hum of a patient's breathing during their most vulnerable moments. The prosecution argues that those same hands were used to guide a woman toward the edge of a jagged cliff, not by accident, but by a chillingly calculated design. As we sit here in the quiet of the night, it is fascinating to consider how a person can live two lives. One in the bright, sterile lights of an operating room, and another in the long, dark shadows of a troubled marriage. Did a Maui anesthesiologist truly bring syringes of poison to a birthday hike? It is a question that sounds like it belongs in a work of fiction, yet the evidence gathered by investigators tells a much more grounding and somber tale. They found items that no hiker should ever need. Medical supplies that were out of place among the water bottles and granola bars. Why did he ask the police, "Wait, she's not dead?" hours after the struggle had supposedly ended? That single question, spoken in a moment of perhaps unintended candor, opened a loop that detectives couldn't ignore. It suggested a man who wasn't just surprised by an accident, but one who was confused that his plan hadn't reached its final, lethal conclusion. As you settle in and let the sound of my voice guide you, try to visualize the Palipuka Trail. It is narrow, carved into the volcanic rock, where one wrong step can lead to the infinite. The wind up there can be unpredictable, whistling through the stone puka or hole in the cliffside. It is the kind of place that demands respect and caution. But for Dr. Koenig and his wife, the danger wasn't just the height or the wind. The danger was standing right next to them. This case takes us into the heart of a high-stakes trial, where the technical language of anesthesia meets the raw, emotional testimony of a woman who looked into her husband's eyes and saw a stranger. As it turned out, the secrets of their life together were far more complex than the image of the successful medical couple they presented to the world. We are going to explore the possibility of what happens when a brilliant mind turns toward darkness. We will look at the records, the medical examiner's insights, and the chilling items left behind on that trail. Tonight, we retrace the steps of a journey defined by betrayal, but also by an incredible will to live. If you are still awake and listening, I invite you to adjust your volume and find a sense of calm. The world outside is still, and here we have the time to understand the truth that was nearly lost at the edge of that cliff. The story of Gerhard Koenig is not just about a crime, it is about the masks people wear. As we move forward, keep in mind the silence of those emerald cliffs. They witnessed a struggle that no one was ever supposed to talk about. But the truth has a rhythmic way of surfacing, even from the deepest canyons. Before we move on to the morning of the hike itself, I want to take a moment to welcome those of you who are joining us for a night of rest. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Perhaps you are in a quiet city or a remote corner of the world. Wherever you are, rest easy as we begin to unmask the man who stood at the edge of death. The morning of March 24th, 2025, began with the kind of crystalline Pacific sky that makes Hawaii feel like a sanctuary. For Dr. Gerhard Koenig and his wife Arielle, it was a day for celebration, Arielle's 37th birthday. As a nuclear engineer, her life was often defined by precision and complex systems, and a hike up the Pali-Puka Trail seemed like the perfect low-tech escape. They were a couple who appeared to have reached the pinnacle of professional and personal success. Gerhard was a respected figure in the medical community, a man whose hands were trained to heal, while Arielle's intellect was matched only by her adventurous spirit. Together, they began their ascent into the Ko'olau Mountains, leaving the hum of Honolulu behind for the emerald ridges that overlook the island's windward coast. The Pali-Puka Trail is not a path for the faint of heart. It is a narrow, jagged spine of volcanic rock that winds through dense tropical canopy before opening up to sheer, terrifying drops. On this particular day, the trail was officially closed to the public, a fact that added a layer of profound isolation to their journey. The wind at the Pali Pass is legendary, a relentless, howling force that can knock a grown adult off their feet. As they climbed higher, the beauty of the island laid out beneath them began to contrast sharply with the physical danger of the terrain. The path is often no wider than a few feet, flanked by a 300-foot abyss on one side and a vertical stone wall on the other. It is the kind of place where nature demands absolute focus, yet for those who know the trail, it is also a place of haunting, quiet majesty. The transition from a celebratory birthday stroll to a scene of absolute horror happened in a heartbeat. Not far behind the Koenigs were two other hikers, Amanda Morris and Sarah Buxbaum. They had been enjoying the solitude of the closed trail when the atmosphere shifted from serene to suffocating. As they rounded a bend near a natural stone window in the cliffside, they spotted two figures near the edge. At first glance, it looked like a private moment between a couple, perhaps a quiet rest, or an intimate conversation against the backdrop of the ocean. But as the witnesses drew closer, the perspective shifted, revealing a much darker reality. What looked like a lover's embrace from a distance was actually a frantic struggle against the gravity of a 300-foot abyss. The two women watched in frozen disbelief as they realized the man, later identified as Gerhardt, was straddling Aurelia. He wasn't holding her for safety. He was pinning her to the jagged earth. In his hand, he gripped a heavy, dark piece of lava rock, a natural weapon formed from the very mountain they stood upon. With a terrifying, rhythmic precision, he began striking her. The witnesses described the sound as dull and repetitive, echoing against the stone walls of the pass. It was a sight that defied logic. A doctor, a man sworn to protect life, using the raw elements of the earth to try and end the life of the woman he had promised to cherish. Amidst the chaos of the struggle, Amanda and Sarah noticed a specific detail that would later become a focal point for investigators. Strapped tightly around Gerhardt's waist was a black fanny pack. In the heat of the moment, it seemed like a mundane piece of hiking gear, but the way it remained secured to him during the violent exertion suggested it was more than just a place for keys or a phone. Inside that small polyester pouch were medical tools, items from his professional life that hinted at a much more calculated intent than a spontaneous outburst of rage. It was a lingering question that hung in the air even as the witnesses scrambled to find cell service to place a frantic 911 call. The screams of the witnesses eventually broke the trance of the assault. As they yelled for him to stop, Gerhardt looked up, his expression unreadable against the whipping wind. Realizing he was no longer alone in the isolation of the Pali Puka, he stood up and backed away from the crumpled form of his wife. While Ariel lay bleeding from 10 deep lacerations to her head, her birthday clothes stained with the red dust of the trail, the man she loved turned toward the thick Hawaiian brush. Without a word, he vanished into the dense, tangled greenery of the mountainside, leaving behind a scene of wreckage and a woman fighting for every breath. As Ariel was rushed to the hospital with 10 lacerations to her head, the man she loved vanished into the dense Hawaiian brush. The damp, heavy heat of the Oahu night settled over the trailhead as the first police units arrived, their tires crunching on the gravel and their blue and red lights fracturing against the waxy leaves of the surrounding jungle. While Ariel was being stabilized by paramedics, her husband, Dr. Gerhard Koenig, was becoming a ghost in the vastness of the Hawaiian wilderness. For 8 hours, a man who spent his days in the sterile, controlled environment of an operating room was now navigating the jagged, unpredictable terrain of the mountainside in total darkness. Investigators would later describe the search as a race against the elements, unsure if they were looking for a man who had suffered a mental break or a calculated predator waiting for the cover of night to make his final escape. The silence of the woods was eventually broken, not by a physical discovery, but by a digital one. Miles away, Gerhardt's adult son sat in the flickering light of his phone, staring at a FaceTime notification from his father. It was a call that would later become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. According to the son's chilling testimony, the image on the screen was disorienting. His father appeared disheveled, his breathing heavy against the backdrop of the rustling trees. During that conversation, Gerhardt allegedly uttered a sentence that stripped away any veneer of a hiking accident. He told his son, quite simply, that he had tried to kill Aurelia, but that she had gotten away. At the time, the son could hardly process the weight of those words. The idea that the healer who had raised him was now confessing to a brutal act of violence in the middle of a forest. As the clock ticked toward the early morning hours, the manhunt narrowed its focus back toward the trailhead. It was there, near the very spot where the birthday hike had begun, that officers finally spotted a figure emerging from the shadows. Gerhard Koenig didn't look like a prominent physician anymore. He was covered in dirt, his clothes torn by the thick Hawaiian brush, and his eyes carried a vacant, hollow stare that suggested he was miles away from reality. When the officers moved in to apprehend him, there was no struggle. There was only a heavy, suffocating silence. However, as the handcuffs clicked into place, Gerhardt broke that silence with a spontaneous utterance that would haunt the entire trial. He looked at the arresting officers, his voice devoid of the panic one might expect from a man in his position, and asked a question that felt like a cold blade. "Wait, she's not dead." To the investigators standing in the rain, it didn't sound like a question of hope. It sounded like a verification of a failed task. The words of a healer often carry the weight of life, but that night, Gerhardt's words sounded like a final diagnosis of a failed intent. It was as if he was checking the vitals of a crime he thought he had completed. The prosecution would later argue that this was the ultimate slip of the tongue, a moment of honest clarity before the legal defenses could be constructed. But as the case began to take shape, a different narrative started to emerge from the doctor's camp. The defense introduced a concept they called the alibi loop, a psychological counterclaim suggesting that Gerhardt hadn't been a predator at all, but a victim of a sudden, inexplicable, dissociative shock. They argued that the trauma of a physical altercation, which they claimed Ariel had initiated, sent his mind into a protective fugue state. In this version of the story, the FaceTime call and the chilling question to the police weren't confessions, but the ramblings of a man whose brain had fractured under the pressure of a domestic nightmare. As you listen to the rhythmic hum of the rain outside, it's worth considering how thin the line is between a calculated plan and a spontaneous breakdown. To the neighbors and colleagues who knew the Koenigs, the idea of Gerhardt as a fugitive in the jungle felt like a story from another world. They lived a life of quiet clockwork precision, a paradise of professional success and island beauty. But to understand why a doctor would bring a rock to a birthday hike, we have to look back at the cracks forming in the Koenig's paradise months earlier. If you're still awake and listening, I'm curious to know if you believe a person's mind can truly switch off during an act of violence, or if the dissociative shock defense feels like a convenient shield. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. But for now, we must look closer at the months leading up to that hike, where the deception was already beginning to bloom. Would you like me to move on to Chapter 3, where we peel back the layers of the Koenig's marriage and discover the secrets hidden in the Decembers before the mountain? The December air in Maui doesn't carry the bite of a mainland winter, but inside the Koenig home, The atmosphere had turned glacial. It was 2024, a year that should have been defined by the couple's professional triumphs. Yet it became the season where the foundation of their life together began to spiderweb with cracks. Gerhardt was a man who lived by the clock and the monitor, someone who understood that a single milligram of deviation could mean the difference between life and death. Perhaps that is why, when he noticed the subtle shifts in Ariel's behavior, he didn't just feel a sense of worry. He began to treat his marriage like a failing patient. He discovered the messages on a quiet Tuesday evening. It wasn't a physical betrayal, not yet, but an emotional affair with a coworker that hit Gerhardt with the force of a clinical complication he couldn't medicate away. Aurelia, a woman whose entire career as a nuclear engineer was built on the pillars of logic, precision, and the management of volatile systems, found herself trapped in a domestic landscape that was becoming increasingly unstable. She was used to calculating half-lives and containment protocols, yet she couldn't seem to contain the growing jealousy of the man she shared a bed with. As the weeks bled into January, the couple retreated into the sterile environment of marital counseling. They sat on leather couches, dissecting years of shared history under the flickering fluorescent lights of a therapist's office. Gerhardt's reaction to the perceived betrayal wasn't one of explosive anger, but rather a cold, systematic tightening of control. He began to monitor her movements with the same obsessive detail he used to track a patient's heart rate during a complex surgery. He wanted to know where she was, who she was speaking to, and why the rhythm of their daily life had lost its familiar cadence. There is a profound, almost haunting contrast in the life Gerhardt Koenig led during those months. By day, he walked the quiet, sanitized hallways of the hospital, draped in the blue scrubs of a savior. He was a master of vitals, a man who could steady a failing pulse with a calm word and a steady hand. He was trusted with the literal breath of his community. Yet, when he crossed the threshold of his own home, that mastery vanished. He could no longer feel the pulse of his own marriage. The irony was thick and suffocating. The man who spent his life keeping others from the edge of the abyss was watching his own world slide into it. Ariel tried to apply her engineering mind to the problem. She looked for the variables, the points of failure, the ways to reinforce the structure of their partnership. But logic is a poor shield against a partner's escalating paranoia. She was a woman of high intellect, someone who understood the complexities of the physical world, but she found herself unable to navigate the emotional minefield Gerhardt was laying around her. The precision she valued so much was being used against her, as Gerhardt turned his analytical mind toward surveillance. This brings us to a question that often haunts the quiet hours of an investigation: the identity paradox. Is it possible for a person to be a dedicated lifesaver in the light of day and a calculated predator in the shadows of the night? We want to believe that the hands that heal cannot be the same hands that harm. But the history of the human psyche tells a much more complicated story. As the tension of that winter set the stage for the spring, the boundary between Gerhardt's professional tools and his personal desperation began to blur. It wouldn't be long before a simple bag of medical supplies, the very instruments of his mercy, would become the prosecution's smoking gun. The transition from the wind-swept cliffs of Palipuca to the clinical detail of a police interrogation room changed the entire frequency of the investigation. While the physical struggle on the ledge was a matter of one person's word against another, the introduction of medical hardware shifted the narrative into a darker, more calculated territory. During her initial statements and her later, more harrowing testimony, Ariel described a detail that chilled the seasoned investigators to the bone. She claimed that during the frantic, silent struggle on the edge of the abyss, Gerhardt wasn't just using his physical strength to subdue her. She testified that she saw him reaching for, and eventually brandishing, two distinct syringes. According to her account, he wasn't just trying to push her, he was trying to sedate her, to render her incapable of fighting back before she met the rocks below. This accusation transformed the case from a domestic dispute gone wrong into something far more predatory. However, there was a glaring physical problem with this version of events. When the 911 callers first arrived at the scene, and later when the Honolulu police conducted their initial sweep of the cliffside and the surrounding brush, they found absolutely nothing. There were no plastic caps, no discarded needles, and certainly no glass vials lying in the red dirt or caught in the tropical foliage. For months, the syringe theory remained exactly that, a terrifying memory held by a traumatized woman, but one that lacked any corroborating physical evidence. Gerhardt's defense team was quick to point this out, suggesting that in the adrenaline-fueled terror of the moment, Ariel's mind had conjured instruments of his profession to make the story seem more villainous. The silence regarding this evidence lasted until the spring, long after the winter of their separation had turned into the bitter spring of a divorce filing. It was then that Ariel made a discovery that could reframe the entire timeline of the attempted murder. While clearing out a closet in their shared home, she came across a fanny pack that Gerhardt had allegedly left behind in the chaos of their split. Inside, tucked away in the zippered compartments, she didn't just find medical tape or a stethoscope. She found the very things she had described on the cliff: vials of powerful anesthesia and a set of ready-to-use syringes. The drugs found were not the kind of over-the-counter sedatives one might use for a long flight. They were heavy-duty clinical agents, propofol and fentanyl. To the average person, these are just names in a medical journal, but to an anesthesiologist like Gerhard Koenig, they were the bread and butter of his daily existence. Propofol is known in the medical community for its rapid onset. It is the milk of amnesia, capable of rendering a patient unconscious in mere seconds. Fentanyl, a potent synthetic opioid, is used to manage extreme pain, but also suppresses the respiratory drive. In the hands of a layman, these are dangerous. In the hands of an expert, they are a precise toggle switch between life and death. The tools of his trade, designed to block pain, were now alleged to be the instruments of a permanent silence. Medical experts brought into the fold began to discuss the terrifying efficiency of such a plan. An anesthesiologist knows exactly where to find a vein, even in the dark, and they know the precise dosage required to ensure a person cannot scream, cannot run, and cannot remember the moments before the end. The presence of these vials and syringes in a personal fanny pack at his home long after he had left his post at the hospital, began to cast a long, surgical shadow over his defense. It was no longer a case of a husband and wife arguing on a trail. It was becoming a case of a predator who brought the instruments of his clinic into the wilderness. If you were on that jury, would you believe the syringes were real, or a convenient discovery made after the divorce was filed? Could a trained medical professional truly have been so careless as to leave behind the smoking guns of an attempted murder in a closet he knew his wife would eventually clean? Or was it possible that Aurelia, knowing the exact tools of her husband's profession, had placed them there to ensure a conviction in a case that was otherwise her word against his? With the evidence mounting, the trial moved from the cliffs of Palipuka to the sterile light of a Honolulu courtroom. The transition from the chaotic, wind-blown scene of the struggle to the controlled, hushed environment of the legal system brought with it a new kind of intensity. The air in the courtroom was different. It smelled of floor wax and old paper instead of salt spray and tropical damp. The jurors sat in their wooden chairs, their faces unreadable as they prepared to hear the opening salvos of a trial that would decide the fate of a man who spent his life in the balance between consciousness and the void. The prosecution began by painting a picture of a man whose surgical precision extended far beyond the operating theater. They argued that the birthday trip to the secluded cliffs was never intended to be a celebration of life, but a meticulously planned execution. To the state, Gerhard Koenig was not a panicked husband, but a hunter who had lured his prey to the edge of the world, where the wind would swallow her screams and the sea would hide the evidence. They presented the timeline not as a series of unfortunate events, but as a countdown. Every mile driven toward those cliffs was, in their view, a step toward a premeditated end. They spoke of the affair not as a motive for a sudden argument, but as the catalyst for a cold, calculated removal of an obstacle. The prosecution's theory was simple. Gerhard wanted a new life, and Ariel was the only thing standing in the way of it. But when the defense rose, the atmosphere in the room shifted from cold calculation to the heat of human frailty. They didn't deny that an altercation had occurred, but they reframed the entire evening as a tragic explosion of suppressed emotion. According to the defense, it was Ariel who had struck first. They claimed that during a confrontation about Gerhardt's infidelity, Ariel's hurt had turned into a physical rage, and in that moment, the perfect doctor finally snapped. They called it a heat of passion defense, a momentary lapse where the rational mind is bypassed by a primal instinct to survive and strike back. It was a strategy designed to turn the predator back into a victim of his own circumstances, suggesting that any man, no matter how educated or composed, has a breaking point when pushed by the person he once loved. The courtroom became a theater of physics and biology, where every laceration was measured against the intent of the heart. The defense leaned heavily into the medical reports, which provided a stark contrast to the prosecution's gruesome narrative. They pointed out that while the scene at the cliffs had been undeniably bloody, Ariel's injuries were remarkably superficial for an attempted murder. There were no skull fractures. There were no brain bleeds. The defense questioned how a man with Gerhardt's intimate knowledge of human anatomy a man who spent his days repairing the most delicate structures of the body, could fail so completely to kill someone if that had truly been his intent. They argued that the lack of life-threatening trauma was proof that he hadn't been trying to end her life, but was merely engaged in a chaotic, desperate scuffle. This led to the 10 blows dispute, which became a focal point of the first day's testimony. The prosecution had alleged that Gerhardt struck Ariel 10 times with a heavy rock, a number that suggested a relentless, murderous energy. However, the defense countered with a simple, stinging question. If a grown man, a surgeon no less, hits a woman 10 times in the head with a stone, why was she released from the hospital so quickly? They suggested the number was the exaggeration, a product of a traumatized memory or a prosecutorial overreach. They painted the image of a much shorter, much more frantic encounter. Not a rhythmic bludgeoning, but a few seconds of blind, regrettable chaos. As the legal team sparred, the defense sought to recontextualize the most damaging piece of evidence yet, that haunting question Gerhardt had asked the first responders. Wait, she's not dead? The prosecution had framed this as the disappointment of a failed assassin, a moment where the mask slipped to reveal a man frustrated by his own incompetence. But the defense offered a different vibration for those words. They suggested it was the genuine, disbelieving shock of a man who thought he had committed the unthinkable in a moment of madness. They argued that it wasn't a question of regret that she survived, but a question of staggering relief and confusion. The voice of someone waking up from a nightmare and realizing the world hadn't ended after all. Every word spoken by the attorneys seemed to vibrate against the heavy oak paneling of the room. The jurors watched Gerhardt, looking for any sign of the perfect doctor or the calculated killer. At the defense table, he remained a study in stillness, his hands folded, his eyes often fixed on the mahogany surface in front of him. He looked like a man who was watching his own life being dissected on a stainless steel table, powerless to stop the surgeons of the law from exposing every flaw and every secret. As the witnesses took the stand, the image of the perfect doctor began to dissolve under cross-examination. The transition from theory to testimony brought with it a new set of challenges for the defense, as the cold reality of the evidence began to clash with their narrative of a spontaneous accident. The quiet murmurs of the gallery grew louder as the first day drew to a close, leaving the courtroom in a state of uneasy tension. The tension in the courtroom shifted from the clinical to the visceral as the prosecution called Amanda and Sarah to the stand. These two women, who had set out that morning for nothing more than a scenic hike through the rugged Oregon terrain, now carried the heavy burden of being the only human lenses through which the jury could view the moment of the struggle. They spoke with a synchronized kind of trauma, their voices sometimes faltering as they described the initial sound that broke the silence of the trail. It wasn't a bird or a shifting of the earth, but a human cry. Sharp, jagged, and entirely out of place in the vastness of the wilderness. Amanda testified first, her hands trembling slightly as she recounted rounding a bend in the path and seeing two figures locked in a frantic, swaying embrace. At first, she thought it might have been a fall, or perhaps a moment of intense grief between a couple. But as the distance closed to 50 feet, the reality of the situation began to settle in her chest like lead. She described seeing Gerhard Koenig standing over Ariel, his posture not one of a man trying to help someone up, but of a predator pinning something down. The atmospheric calm of the woods had been replaced by a frantic energy that felt, as she put it, like the world was breaking apart. Then came the detail that seemed to freeze the air in the gallery. Both women testified to seeing Gerhardt reach down and seize a piece of the local landscape. It was a jagged chunk of basalt, a dark and porous lava rock common to the area, yet strangely specific in its application. Sarah described how Gerhardt didn't just drop the stone. He brought it down with what she called full force, a rhythmic and deliberate motion aimed directly at Ariel's head. The sound of the impact, she said, was something she would later hear every time she closed her eyes to sleep. It was a dull, wet thud that signaled the end of any pretense of an accident. There was a peculiar focus during the testimony on the rock itself. Investigators would later note that the specific type of basalt found at the scene was slightly different in mineral composition than the stones immediately surrounding the trail. This raised a haunting micro-loop of a question. Had Gerhardt picked up that weapon in the heat of a sudden rage, or had he carried that specific heavy weight with him, waiting for the right moment of isolation? To the witnesses, however, the geology mattered less than the intent. They were certain of what they saw. They described how their own screams, instinctive, piercing, and relentless, were the only things that seemed to break Gerhardt's focus. It was their presence, their intrusion into his private, violent world, that they believed saved Ariel's life. They saw him pause, the rock still gripped in his hand, looking at them with a blank, hollow expression before the reality of being watched finally took hold. The defense, however, was prepared to claw at the edges of this memory. During cross-examination, the tone turned sharp. Gerhardt's lawyers pointed to the dense brush and the uneven elevation of the trail. They questioned if, from 50 feet away and through the flickering shadows of the pines, two terrified hikers could truly distinguish between a man trying to restrain a frantic, slipping woman and a man intended to cause her harm. They hammered home the idea that in the wilderness, there are no cameras, only the fallible memory of those who happen to be looking when the world breaks apart. They suggested that the full force the women described was actually Gerhardt's desperate attempt to keep Ariel from falling further down the embankment. Yet, the witnesses remained steadfast, their recollection of that dark lava rock etched into their minds with terrifying clarity. But as the day's testimony drew to a close, the courtroom realized that the most damning testimony wouldn't come from a stranger. It would come from the woman who shared his bed. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom seemed to groan as Ariel Koenig walked toward the witness stand, her footsteps muffled by the industrial carpeting. She sat down, her frame appearing small against the high-backed chair. And for a moment, the only sound in the room was the low, rhythmic hum of the overhead projector fan. When she began to speak, there was no histrionics or weeping. Instead, she spoke with the precision of a nuclear engineer, charting the fallout of a marriage that had reached critical mass. She described the hike not as a romantic getaway, but as a calculated trek into a void. To Ariel, the celebration of their anniversary had transitioned into a slaughter the moment they stepped away from the main trail. She recounted how the air felt thinner near the edge, and how Gerhardt's demeanor had shifted from the attentive husband to something distant and cold. She told the jury about the view from the 300-foot drop, a height that turns the jagged rocks below into a blurred mosaic of gray and black. It was there, she testified, that the illusion of safety finally shattered. She described the physical sensation of the betrayal, the sudden, violent force of being pushed toward the abyss. She spoke of the terrifying disconnect between the man she loved and the hands that were now propelling her toward her death. Most chillingly, she recounted the exact internal resonance of the rock hitting her skull. It wasn't just a blow. It was a sound that vibrated through her entire being. A dull, wet thud that signaled the end of her life as she knew it. She described the smell of the dirt and the copper tang of blood as she lay broken on the ledge, watching her husband look down at her with a face that held no trace of the man she had married. However, the atmosphere in the room shifted as the defense stood up for cross-examination. The melancholy tone was pierced by a sharper, more accusatory energy. The defense attorney immediately pivoted to the couple's finances, specifically a withdrawal of nearly $130,000. Records show that just days after the incident, while Gerhardt was being processed by authorities, Ariel had moved almost the entirety of their joint funds into a private account. The defense grilled her on this timing, suggesting that her survival wasn't just a miracle, but a lucrative opportunity. They painted a picture of a woman who was not a victim, but a strategist, someone who saw a failing marriage and decided to exit with a golden parachute. The pressure didn't stop at the bank statements. The defense turned the jury's attention toward a restraining order and allegations of prior sexual abuse and intense jealousy. These were claims that had never appeared in any medical record or police report during the years of their marriage. They emerged only after Gerhardt was in handcuffs. The defense suggested that Ariel was retroactively rewriting their history to ensure a conviction, building a narrative of a monster to justify her own actions after the fall. They questioned why a woman who claimed to be living in such fear would agree to go on a secluded mountain hike alone with her supposed tormentor. It was a calculated attempt to frame the entire incident as a tragic accident being exploited by a vengeful, greedy spouse. Ariel remained composed, even as the defense attempted to dismantle her character. She looked toward the evidence table where her wedding ring sat sealed in a clear plastic bag, a shimmering circle of gold that now represented a cage rather than a commitment. She spoke about the illusion of safety that defines so many domestic tragedies. A paradise hike, she explained, is the ultimate mask for dark intent because the victim wants to believe in the beauty of the setting. They want to believe that the person holding their hand is there to steady them, not to let go. As the jury looked at the blood-stained clothing entered into evidence, seeing the physical remnants of that afternoon, the defense prepared its most controversial move. The courtroom remained still as the defense team began to dismantle the physical narrative presented by the prosecution, shifting the focus from the height of the cliffs to the microscopic world of forensic evidence. While the state had painted a picture of a calculated, violent struggle, the defense pointed to the silence of the physical world. They argued that if a struggle of that magnitude had truly occurred, the earth would have kept a record. Yet, when the forensic analysts took the stand, they admitted that the primary weapon alleged by the state, the rock, bore no usable DNA from Dr. Gerhard Koenig. It was a jagged piece of the island's natural landscape, yet it was curiously devoid of the biological signatures one would expect from a man supposedly wielding it in a lethal frenzy. Furthermore, the defense highlighted a gaping hole in the crime scene processing: the missing syringes. Ariel had testified to being injected, to feeling the cold sting of a needle, yet no such medical waste was recovered from the immediate area of the trail. The defense suggested that in a moment of such high adrenaline and life or death stakes, a person would not have the presence of mind to perfectly dispose of medical paraphernalia while simultaneously attempting to hide a body. This forensic gap led directly into a high-stakes legal battle over the concept of hearsay. The prosecution's case leaned heavily on a FaceTime call, a digital confession supposedly made by Gerhardt to his son in the frantic aftermath of the incident. The defense argued vehemently that this testimony was unreliable, a product of a strained familial dynamic and the chaotic nature of a long-distance, pixelated conversation. They moved to have the confession thrown out, labeling it as a hearsay trap that lacked the context of the doctor's actual state of mind. They suggested that what the son perceived as a confession was actually the ramblings of a man in shock, a father reaching out in a moment of profound psychological collapse, rather than a killer admitting to a crime. As the trial moved into the territory of medical probability, the defense brought in their own expert witnesses, men and women who had spent their lives in the same sterile, high-stakes environments as Dr. Koenig. They spoke about the nature of anesthesia with a clinical, chilling precision. The defense argued that if a master of anesthesia truly wanted someone dead, they wouldn't use a rock. They would use a shadow. They explained that an anesthesiologist possesses the godlike power to blink a person out of existence with a milliliter of fluid, a death that would look like a natural cardiac arrest, leaving no bruises, no broken bones, and no struggle. The fact that Ariel was alive, they argued, was not a miracle of her own resilience, but proof that Gerhardt never intended for her to die. If he had used his professional skill set, there would be no survivor to testify. This brought the jury to the substantial step legal requirement. In the eyes of the law, for an attempted murder charge to stick, the defendant must have taken a substantial step toward the commission of the crime, a point of no return. The defense posited that Gerhardt's actions, however erratic or harmful they may have been, never crossed that threshold into a dedicated attempt on her life. They painted him as a man who perhaps wanted to hurt, or perhaps wanted to scare, but who ultimately lacked the malice aforethought required for a life sentence. They bolstered this by pointing to Gerhardt's life before that afternoon. He was a man with no prior criminal record, a respected pillar of the medical community who had spent decades saving lives on the operating table. He was the man you trusted when you were at your most vulnerable, the one who kept watch over your heartbeat while you slept. The defense asked the jury to consider if it was more likely that a lifelong healer had suddenly turned into a calculated monster, or if a tragic, messy domestic dispute had simply spiraled out of control in the heat of the Hawaiian sun. The trial of Dr. Koenig wasn't just about what happened on the trail, but about the secrets kept in the shadows of a Maui home. The hospital where Gerhard Koenig had spent decades climbing the ranks to become a respected anesthesiologist was the first to distance itself from the shadow of the Pali Puka. Within weeks of the formal charges being filed, the administration issued a terse 2-paragraph statement that effectively erased his legacy. His name was scrubbed from the directory, his privileges were revoked, and his once revered expertise was suddenly treated like a liability. For a man whose entire identity was wrapped in the precision of his medical practice, this professional exile was a slow, agonizing death of its own. He was no longer the man who saved lives under the flickering lights of the operating room. To the medical community, he had become a cautionary tale of how quickly a white coat can be stained by the darkness of a private life. The fallout within the Koenig household was even more devastating, leaving a permanent rift that no courtroom verdict could ever truly mend. The divorce proceedings were not just a legal separation, but a public autopsy of a marriage that had been hollowed out long before that fateful hike. As the custody battle over their younger children intensified, the most painful blow came from Gerhardt's eldest son. The young man, who had once looked up to his father as a pillar of strength, became a key figure in the prosecution's narrative. Testifying to a side of Gerhardt the public had never seen, the rift between father and son became a permanent canyon, wide and deep, ensuring that even if Gerhardt walked free, he would do so as a stranger to his own blood. Outside the courtroom, the digital world had already reached its own consensus. On social media, the hashtag anesthesiologist of death began to trend, turning a complex legal battle into a viral sensation. Armchair detectives dissected every frame of the trail footage, every grain of sand in the crime scene photos, and every twitch of Gerhardt's jaw during the trial. To the millions watching from behind their screens, he wasn't a man presumed innocent until proven guilty. He was a character in a true crime thriller, a villain whose downfall provided a macabre form of entertainment. The public perception was a tidal wave that couldn't be held back, leaving Gerhardt's reputation in ruins long before the jury ever retreated to deliberate. As of March 2026, the legal battle continues to wind through the Hawaiian court system, a marathon of motions, appeals, and expert testimony that seems to have no end in sight. The trial has become a landmark case in the state, highlighting the intersection of domestic strife and the unforgiving nature of the island's terrain. Legal analysts spend hours debating the nuances of the physical evidence, yet the heart of the matter remains as obscured as the trail on a rainy morning. Whatever the jury decides, the Dr. Koenig who walked up that trail never came back down. The man who stands in the defendant's dock is a ghost of the person he used to be, haunted by the memory of a cliffside that took everything from him. We are approaching the end of our journey tonight. Stay with me for the final thoughts on what this case teaches us about the fragility of trust and the thin line between a life of service and a moment of madness. It is in these quiet reflections that we often find the truths that the courtroom misses, the small human details that get lost in the roar of the prosecution and the defense. As the mist settles over the Palipuka once again, we are left with the quiet of the aftermath, a stillness that feels heavy with the weight of what was lost on that high-altitude trail. The Pacific Ocean continues to churn below those cliffs, indifferent to the lives shattered on the rocks above, reminding us that nature keeps its secrets long after the world has moved on to the next headline. The gavel's final strike usually signals the end of a story in the eyes of the law, but for those who followed the trial of Dr. Gerhard Koenig, that sound was merely the beginning of a long, echoing silence. As we look back at the jagged cliffs of the Palipuka, we are forced to confront the literal and metaphorical edge of death that defined this entire ordeal. It is a place where the air grows thin and the ground becomes treacherous, a physical manifestation of the boundary between a life of prestige and a descent into the unthinkable. For Gerhard, that edge was not just a geographic coordinate on a Hawaiian map. It was the thin line between the man the world saw, a healer, a husband, a pillar of his profession, and the man the prosecution described. A calculated shadow driven by impulses could no longer contain. The cliffside serves as a haunting reminder of how fragile our reality truly is. In these final moments, I want to leave you with a wish for peace. The world can be a complicated and sometimes frightening place, filled with stories that challenge our understanding of right and wrong. But tonight, those stories are held at bay. You are in a space where the only requirement is to let go and breathe. Allow the heavy rain of the soundscape to wash away the lingering questions of the Koenig case. Let the pulse of the white light on your screen be the only thing that occupies your vision until your eyes naturally heavy and close. You have navigated the twists and turns of a complex human drama, and now you have earned the right to exit the theater and find rest. The house is empty now. The secrets are laid to rest in the records of the court, and you can finally close your eyes, knowing the story has reached its end. Sleep well. If you are still awake, you might find a different kind of quiet in our deep dive into the hidden cellar mystery, available now on your screen. Good night.